Siete in diretta.
Okay, good morning here in South America and good afternoon in Europe. Welcome to this symposium looking for integral development that we are starting this second day of the symposium. Welcome everybody to this second day of the symposium looking for integral development and Buen Vivir, organized by the University of Ferrara of Italy, the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, the Innovation for Sustainable Development Network, Amistades, and the International University Network, Roots Towards Sustainability. This symposium is also part of the PhD program in Environmental Sustainability and Wellbeing of the University of Ferrara. Today we're starting the second day of the symposium. I want to remind you that last Wednesday, on the first day, we had an international panel with great people as Michelle Bachelet, Alberto Acosta, Patrizio Bianchi, Enrique Iglesias, Monsignor Giancarlo Pergo, and Romano Prodi, discussing about the needs for new ways of integration and collaboration, especially between Latin America and Europe, to confront actual challenge as climate and global change and the effects of COVID pandemic, with others as the change of global value chains, productions, and consumptions. They also talk about the new ways we need to understand and we need to develop and conceptualize the different ways of development or buen vivir or well-being. Today, we will continue this conversation with an extraordinary panel of scholars and policymakers who had an impressive backgrounds on economical and social issues. We want to address with them two main questions related to how we can transform the actual situation in a more integral development process. What is the transitions we need to make? What are the institutions, name institutions as organizations, rules, procedures we need to develop? What are the tools we need to create? And one very important situation, how do we foster collaborations between institutions and in this case between the European Union and Latin America? The panel will be organized in this way. We will have the first round of speeches with 5 to 7 minutes each panelist. Sorry that I have to do two things at the same time, and this is quite difficult sometimes. And so we will have this first round with 5 to 7 minutes to each panelist. And then we will have some questions. And then we will move to the second round of speeches. As I told you before, we want to focus these panels on an institutions and tools for integral development and international collaboration. For the first round, we have prepared these framework questions. That is, given the current pandemic situation and the upheavals that are taking place, what the role that institutions and groups that you represent or you are part of play in developing an alternative economic model or an alternative economic paradigm to foster integral development around the world? We will start this panel with, sorry that we have a lot of people in the waiting room that are meeting now. we will start this panel with Ana Barrera. I will introduce Ana. Ana Barrera. Excuse me. She studied political science and public law at the Free University of Berlin and obtained her doctoral degree in political science from the University of Hamburg and GIGA Institute of Latin American Studies. Currently, she works as a senior program manager in the field of higher education, science, technology, and innovation, cultural and multilateral issues at the EU, European Union Latin American Foundation. Her previous positions were related to scientific work as well as international development cooperation. Those positions include the Collaborative Research Center governance in areas of limited stakeholders and other foundations for development. Ana, you have 5 to 7 minutes. I'm going to advise you when you are around 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. On behalf of the EULAC Foundation, I extend a warm greeting to all the organizers of this important symposium and, of course, all the audience which is listening to us. The question that you have posed me makes me aware of the fact that perhaps I should start first with describing of what the EULAC Foundation actually is. The European Union, Latin America and Caribbean Foundation, EULAC Foundation, was created by the heads of state and governments from Latin America, the Caribbean and the European Union back in May 2010 on their summit. And it started off its activities in November 2011. So in this November, we will be celebrating our 10th anniversary.
Hi.
The foundation.
Can you hear me?
Very tired.
Yeah, I am tired.
The foundation has 62 members. These are 33 states of Latin America and the Caribbean, the 27 members of the European Union and the United Kingdom, and also the European Union itself. On May 2019, the EULAC Foundation was established as an international organization under public international law. The headquarters of our foundation finds itself in the city of Hamburg in Germany. And even if we sound big, we are rather relatively small. We are composed by a team of 11 people from both regions. And this includes our executive director, Dr. Adrián Bonilla from Ecuador, and our president, Ms. Leire Pajin Iraola from Spain. The objective of the EULAC Foundation is to strengthen the strategic partnership between the European Union, Latin America, and the Caribbean, which was created in 1999. And we strive to convert it into a visible reality that counts with the active participation of our respective societies. What are the guidelines? What is our role? The guidelines for our role are typically formulated by the different articulations of the heads of state and government or other representatives of our membership. So one of the most important documents is the EU-CELAC Action Plan, which dates back to 2015. And which was adopted at the Summit of Heads of State and Government in Brussels, and which entails 9 chapters. It includes issues such as science, research, technology, sustainable development, climate change, biodiversity, energy, regional integration and interconnectivity, migration, education and employment, the fight against drug trafficking, gender, investment and entrepreneurship, higher education and citizen security. This is very, very large agenda. Also, we let ourselves guide by declarations and joint communiques from formal and informal meetings of the ministers of foreign affairs from our membership. They met, for example, in 2016, in 2018, and also in December 2020 in Berlin for the last time. And on those instances, states have deepened the issues of collaboration. They determined, for example, that we should also strengthen our collaboration in the issues such as culture, expand our efforts on sustainable development and climate change, and on the promotion of multilateralism in order to achieve the sustainable development goals. And in the last informal meeting held in December 2020, ministers reaffirmed their determination to increase joint efforts to overcome the multidimensional challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which risks exacerbating existing structural inequalities and forms of exclusion within our societies. Also, the role of the EULAC Foundation is determined by orientations given by our Board of Governors. This is the most important authority for us, and it meets regularly 2 times a year. So our member states are also the members of the United Nations, and all of them have adopted in September 2020 the Sustainable Development Agenda with the 17 specific goals as its core, and which were formulated already as lessons learned from its predecessor, the Millennium Goals, and also which are held to be intertwined and holistic in nature, stretching from putting an end to poverty and to hunger, passing by clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, but also adopting measures to reduce inequalities, climate action, and partnerships for the different goals. So all those documents that are guiding the work are, of course, written in the spirit of the umbrella of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the bi-regional strategic partnership strives also to transfer those global goals towards concrete instruments and fields of cooperation on the bi-regional level. Now, when it comes to concrete thematic areas, we currently work in the following thematic areas. For example, higher education, that support actions that are the construction of EULAC area of higher education. We work in the field of science, technology, and innovation. Promoting capacity building and opportunities to develop, to deepen cooperation between scientists and scientific consortia from both regions. Another field is sustainable, resilient, and inclusive economies that we promote exchange of good practices and diversity of economic recovery, which go hand in hand with social inclusion and cohesion, as well as environmental protection. Another thematic is climate change. We promote activities aimed at low emission sustainable development strategies, also to increase knowledge and opportunities in relation to green markets or other sources of climate finance between regions. Another field is culture, in which we develop initiatives mainly promoting issues such as cultural heritage, cultural creative industries, as well as the role of international organizations promote values and cultures, which we have in our regions. And the last field is multilateralism. We try to promote initiatives which highlight multilateral viable architecture and instrument from the perspective of shared principles and values to address global problems of our times. The way how we work is very broad. We basically try to build bridges to support the establishment and context and for the strengthening of existing networks. As a foundation, we offer genuine sites for the regional exchange of views, multiple meetings, dialogue sessions, reflection forums, workshops, seminars, conferences, or say conferences. We also promote the generation of new knowledge by analysis and also studies. And we make sure that knowledge is being transferred from civil society, from the academia, from the practitioners level towards the decision-making level. Identifying practices, interesting quality options, but also recommendations. Through all those forms of work, we invite citizens, researchers, experts, practitioners, entrepreneurs, journalists, as well as decision makers to pool their knowledge, to share their experience, to propose their ideas, and to jointly reflect on specific aspects of challenge to continual sustainable development. In so doing, we pay specific attention to gender equality, the involvement of women in our activities, and also highlight several activities wherein specifically we invite the younger generation to participate, to express and to help voice. Because sustainability means also to go further ahead for the younger generations. Not least, we also pay specific attention to prudence within the two, which is the European Union, America, and the Caribbean. The historical, economic, political reasons have thus far not been deemed involved in the regional relationship. And as we are a small team, as we are still a young foundation, we typically work in alliance with strong partners from references. It can be international organizations, foundations, academic and university associations and networks, cultural institutions, and many more. And just to give you a few examples, we have today also on the panel one from OCD. We are also collaborating very often with the OECD Development Center. We collaborate strongly and oftenly with our strategic partner, the American Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean Club. And we are also dealing with other partners in this symposium. One of our partners is also ILA, the Latin American International Organization. I leave here in order to also to speak here.
Thank you, Anna. Overview of what we're doing in the LAC Foundation. So we'll continue with questions later. Now I want to introduce you to Professor Francisco Gallego. He's a full professor of the Economic Department at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, a research affiliate and scientific director of the Office of the American and Caribbean Office of the Apollo Latin General Poverty Lab. His main research relates to the process of economic development, perspectives, political economy, applied economics, macroeconomics, the economic transportation, externalities, modern empirical development of the economy. He has published articles and papers in many economic journals, and as a visiting professor of Princeton University, Committee of the Latin American Society, member of the Latin American Association, member of the board of the JPOP, the director of the Economics and Study on the leadership. Here he was awarded the Mathematics lectured by the Latin American Financial Society. He will do in bachelor and major degree in economics from the Competition Society of Chile, and a PhD in economics from MIT. Thank you, Professor Gay, for being with us today.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. I want to share some presentation. Let's see if there.
Yes, we were
Thanks a lot for organizing this excellent event. I'm really delighted to be here and the many people from different places, like fields of water, and we are talking about integral development. And I would like just to share some ideas on from some research and development economics from multi-activity perspective. Or people from different places, and try to add to this conversation on like integral development. So I will to basically discuss the idea. I'm going to talk about the problem. In the sense that Gonzalo was motivating us with the question for this round, but then a little bit the method that we use to build this program and a couple of examples that could be interesting. I won't spend much time on this. It was the discussion this last week conversation, this conference. But basically, climate change pressures to do decades of progress in industrialization. How the pandemic is even more complicated. Actually don't have access to basic, for instance, sources of energy, and we know that the energy is really important for like aviation and human development. But at the same time, we know that the way we have produced energy so far that uses a lot of fossil fuels increase pollution that affect the quality of life, mortality, morbidity, etc. And finally, we know at the same time that basically climate change. See here also that how this problem is not a problem of a particular country, it's a problem of different continents where we interact with each other, So this is kind of like a short motivation for the problem, and in a sense, this challenge is a multidimensional problem, which is similar and maybe is another phase of the problem we face, when we try to deal with poverty, inequality, and different situations in the world. And in a sense, we are trying to balance, climate change, with the energy challenge, and this is complicated because we need, as we discussed before, to deal with the energy for creating new opportunities for people, but at the same time, the way we used to create energy, is not sustainable, and has several negative implications. So in a sense, the problem is that we have this multidimensional problem, and in my view, we don't have a silver bullet, to solve this problem, So we need to, in a sense, try to, and at these times of Copa America and Europe Cup in Europe and Latin America, we have to put the ball in the floor, and go to the details on the solutions and the problems. And this is, in a sense, what I want to discuss now. with more detail, which is this method we use in JPAL and this Poverty Action Lab that Gonzalo mentioned before to try to identify, and implement potential solutions. And let me start with this part of my presentation with the Nobel Prize winners of the Economics Nobel Prize in 2019, Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, and Michael Kramer. Two of them founded, actually, were two of the founders of the JPAL, of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which I am affiliated. But I would like to start with a quote that they gave at some point in an interview, where they say something like this, I'm going to skip drop the name that they mentioned here, but they say something like this. They say the difference between some people, and us is that he knows what needs to be done and we don't. We are trying to learn it. And in a sense, like the approach I'm going to try to communicate to you is like the history, of how we try to learn new stuff. And we are learning new stuff, and probably we need to learn much more, in particular about the challenges that we face now. So this is JPAL. And the main statements of JPAL are like two. Poverty is complex, and we can say the same about like the challenges we face now to create like a more sustainable world, an integral development. We would say here, instead of poverty, we could say integral development is complex, and it's going to create, to fight this problem, to create, solutions for like improving like integral development, we can use scientific evidence. And this is the main statement of JPAL. And we try to use this scientific approach to innovate, test, and scale up solutions to the problems we face. What this means in practice, basically, is like doing three things, doing research, which is basically a key component of our approach of this institution, which is what we're talking now in this part of the roundtable. So we do research on new stuff, and in particular, JPAL has some money to do this with international collaboration, etc. We try to do policy outreach, which is basically communicate what is learned in the scientific realm to like the policy dimension, which means like communicating results, building partnerships, lending like technical assistance, and in many cases, including like even embedding like staff in governments and organizations, and capacity building, which is like training, and developing like basically like through in-person or online education. So the idea basically is that we try to translate research into action. And just to give you a sense, and this is, I think is important for the conversation we are having here, and might be an interesting example, maybe similar to what Anna mentioned before, which is that JPAL is based in 7 regional offices, where the idea is to have always, in each place where we work, to have like a local university that is basically like the house of JPAL in the continent or subcontinent. In the case of the 2 continents that we're talking about in this symposium, we have like in Europe, in the Paris School of Economics at Paris, like the JPAL Europe office. And in our case, in Chile, we have like the JPAL LAC office, the Latin American and the Caribbean office, which is based at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, where I am a professor. So, and I think this is interesting because, as you can see here, basically, and I'm going to show one example in a second, there is a lot of conversation across people who are located in different places, who are working in different places. To do this, you need basically an interface where you have like researchers based in top universities in the world, local researchers, local communities, governments, NGOs, international organizations, and academia at the local level too. So many universities, and we work in different sectors, as you can see here, that are closely related to the sustainable development goals. And this is like kind of an increasing there is an increasing number of areas where we work. You can see here gender, crime, agriculture, firms, health, environment, energy and climate change, political economy, labor markets, etc. Which means that in the end, there are like more than 1,000 evaluations in the world in 88 countries. You can see here like different colors from different areas. And you can see like the diversity that we have in the world, where in a sense, each dot here represents like a different question, research question or public policy challenge, And what is interesting, how you basically generate like conversations between these different dots to understand, what's going on, and to propose, as it is the motivation for this conversation today, like alternative ways of solving the problems. So what is interesting too is that this is not just like an academic exercise, but we, as we said before, we try to translate research into action. And if you want to like count how many people have been affected, by scale-up policies after being evaluated by this network of international J-PAL affiliates, you can see that before the pandemic, we have like 400 million people, affected by scale-up options of, the policies evaluated by J-PAL, including like a bunch of millions in Latin America. And one interesting thing, that I also would like to highlight at this stage. So Gonzalo, I have more time because I don't have to be in the next. I cannot be in the next round, so I can spend like 3 minutes more to. Okay, thanks. No problem. Thanks a lot. So one interesting thing that I would like to flag in this conversation is this, which is in this map, which is this collaboration we have been doing with several governments in Latin America and in the Caribbean, where you can see here that from Mexico to Chile, we have like this idea of working with government agencies to deal with different problems, problems in some cases related to, education, in some cases related to like security, as in Mexico, education in Peru, and also, you can see here in Brazil, working with the Ministerio de Medio Ambiente, in terms of environmental issues. So, and what is interesting about this is when you double click these ideas, you basically have to put together different people. You have to put together like researchers, as I said before, government like officials, governments actually. You need to put together like local researchers. You need to put together like local people, communities that are working in these issues. And the experience so far has been very interesting, and I think it's an example of how to like. As I said before, put the ball in the floor, and try to find actual solutions working with the details of them. So I don't have much time but one interesting, if you are interested, there is a lot of information on the web on this Minedu lab, innovation lab in the Ministry of Education of Peru, which is very interesting. I have been involved in some evaluations, and actually in one particular policy, which is called in Spanish, Decidiendo para un Futuro Mejor. Here you can see the English translations, Choosing a Better Future, which is now like basically trying to deal with school dropouts in Peru, and has been scaled up, and actually there is like now is implemented as a policy to deal with potential dropouts in Peru in the COVID-19 pandemic. So just to close this part, so in a sense, our way of thinking about the question that Gonzalo asked at the beginning of this panel is that we are short on time. We need, in a sense, to find like real world policies, that could solve the problems. And we can do this through innovative measurement techniques and basically doing partnerships with people, trying to connect people with different ways of different from different places, from academia, governments, social society, to solve these problems. And just to finish, in 1 minute or so, one example. So now we are working on this because I'm not going to be in the next part of this conversation, so I am answering the second question, sorry about that, is something that I'm showing you here, which is something that we are working on now, which is this J. Paul King Climate Action Initiative, that is basically trying to get into the conversation on global climate change and the energy challenge, and with work in 4 areas, which is mitigation, adaptation, pollution reduction, and energy access, where we are working on basically typically with partnerships with governments, involving people in different continents, and trying to create a conversation between people in different places, like in different countries, to try to, in a sense, identify generalizable, I never say this word, general solutions to the problems, which is basically first designing, piloting, and evaluating innovations, and then scaling up. And we are very excited. I just wanted to highlight, some research we're doing on this, on energy access. And I don't have time to get into the details, but just I want to show you this slide, not the results, but just focus your attention on this column, where you can see that there is stuff going on in different places, in different continents. And in a sense, the objective of this conversation is not just, to find something which is interesting, like, let's say, for Brazil, or for the Philippines, or South Africa, but to understand what's behind all of them. So maybe there is going back to the question of this panel, maybe there is something which, which is going to help us to identify alternative ways of solving the problems, and have evidence to sustain that part. So I don't have more time. I know Gonzalo, I have more stuff, but I don't have more time. So just to conclude, tough questions and problems, this is a global problem that we are not going to solve at the local level because of obvious externalities and the fact that climate change is affecting everybody at the same time. But also I would like to highlight this because I think there is space to collaboration and learning across countries and cultures, where basically we can learn from each other to identify, the problems, and also to find interesting solutions. So, thanks, grazie, obrigado, gracias.
Thank you very much, Professor Gallego. As Professor Gallego is not going to be part of our second round meeting, I want to tell the audience that you can ask in the chat of the of the Zoom platform, or in Facebook, or in YouTube, where we are broadcasting this seminar, any question that you have for Professor Gallego, so we can have it to him. And of course, any question you have to any of the panelists that are joining us today. Thank you, Professor Gallego, for this great experience of J-PAL that I think it could be very, very interesting for this panel and for the audience. Now I want to introduce you Stephanie Griffin-Jones, our next panelist. Stephanie Griffin-Jones is a financial market program director, Initiative for Policy Dialogue of Columbia University. She's Emeritus Professorial Fellow of the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex University, non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C., a distinguished fellow at Climate Work Foundation, researching and providing policy advice on reforming the international and national finance architecture, the recent emphasis on development banks, on which she co-directed the research conference and program on development banks globally. He had published widely, having written or editing 25 books and a lot of papers. 2010 book co-edited by Joseph Stiglitz and Jose Antonio Campos was Time for a Visible Hand. One of the most recent books published by OUT is The Future of National Development Banks. She advised many international organizations, including European Commission, European Parliament, World Bank, United Nations, and several national governments. Stephanie, it's really a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for being in this symposium.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much to Gianfranco and others for the invitation, and Annalisa, to participate in this important symposium. If I may, I would also like to do both my presentations, if that's okay with you, because I also have a problem.
Yes, you can do it now.
Thank you very much. So I will be talking about development banks, both multilateral, regional, and national, and the role in an alternative model like the one that you're studying, which would basically be, I think, greener, that is more sustainable, fairer, and also more dynamic. And development banks...
Stephanie, excuse me my interruption, but do you want to share some slides with us? Because we are not seeing them.
No, I don't have, well, I have...
okay, sorry. My misunderstanding, sorry.
I can actually send you a longer PowerPoint than the one I was going to present. So that's okay. Later, I can send it to you.
Okay, no, don't worry. Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's fine. So these national development banks have had a sort of renaissance, a rebirth, if you like, particularly since the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, and a further impulse with the COVID pandemic and its disastrous effects on the economies. So we have, I think, a sort of shift to a new development paradigm, new development finance paradigm, which means that that you are moving from either a purely public model of finance or a private sector model as was dominant, if you like, in the 80s and 90s, to a mixed development finance model. And I think that is quite interesting and important. In terms very quickly of the theory, the sort of purely neoliberal theory, neoclassical theory, was not very keen on development banks because they believed in private, efficient financial markets. But that theory has now lost a lot of support because of the problems that the financial sector had, particularly in developing countries in the past, but also much more globally in the so-called global financial sector. So somebody's talking. So then we have maybe two theoretical strong justifications for public development banks. The first one is, if you like, provided by Stiglitz, who in a book which was actually called Whither Socialism, although it was about the market economy, argued, I think, very, very persuasively that financial markets are particularly full of market failures. There are, of course, government failures in financial markets, but these are less frequent and less deep than those private market failures. And therefore, he makes the case for government intervention, or the visible hand, as our book was called, in financial markets, and not necessarily in other markets, because in other markets, maybe markets failures are more dominant than government failures. So this leads you to, if you like, two sets of conclusions. One is financial regulation, which is now widely accepted. And the second one, the need for public development banks. What are the main problems that they are filling? The private finance on its own doesn't provide sufficient finance to long-term credit, to small companies, to new companies, to infrastructure. But also, it doesn't provide the finance needed for, if you like, more mission-oriented structural transformation. And the previous speaker spoke very eloquently about the need for mitigating and adapting to climate change, and that is perhaps the biggest challenge that we face. And that requires a major transformation of the economy. And for that, you need very high levels of investment in conditions of extreme uncertainty. Because when you're going into a new sector, a new activity, you don't know what the risks and the profits are in practice going to be, which is Frank Knight defined as uncertainty. That is risk that you cannot really measure. And in those situations, the private financial sector is always very timid. And therefore, it's very important to have public finance, which works together with private finance, but which takes the lead. And for example, in Europe, this is very clearly understood. Practically every European country now has a development bank. Even the very market-oriented UK under a conservative government has just created an infrastructure bank, a bit small, but it's created it. And of course, we have the major European Investment Bank, which existed since the creation of the European Union, part actually at the insistence of Italy, that wanted funding for the south, the poorer south of Italy. And this European Investment Bank has just been transformed into what is called a climate bank, because at least 50% of its lending by 2025 will have to be in direct elements that contribute to the green transformation. So these development banks are very important instruments for implementing policies. Because when you can't just have a plan or general ideas, you need instruments for governments with collaboration with the private sector to implement that. And I think development banks are very useful instruments. So as I said, there has been a real renaissance, and there was this summit last year of all the development banks of the world, over 450 banks, national, regional, and multilateral. And there was a project to add all their assets, and their assets reach $14 trillion. And each year they lend about $2.3 trillion, which represents actually a large amount, about 10% of world investment. So they are very important actors in the world economy, and they are relatively understudied. And my colleagues and I, José Antonio Campo and many others, have been working on this. First, we were very lonely on our own. There was very little interest, but increasingly there is a lot of interest, both amongst academics and also amongst policymakers. An impetus was given, for example, when China led and BRICS led the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank was created, and then the New Development Bank, or the BRICS Bank. At the same time, when the Eurozone debt crisis happened in the last decade, the role of the European Investment Bank was very significantly increased. And I think that that is interesting because at that time, as you in Italy know much better than me, there was a lot of emphasis on not having a sufficiently expansionary fiscal policy because the northern countries of Europe didn't want to have a more expansionary fiscal policy. And they refused the requests from the South, both at the European level and in allowing southern countries to have greater flexibility in the Growth and Stability Pact. But what they did allow was an expansion of the European Investment Bank, which was a sort of substitute, and I would say an incomplete substitute of fiscal policy. And in this current stage, it's interesting because in Europe, they've forgotten all about fiscal prudence. I think Schäuble still remembers, but most people have become much more Keynesian. They have suspended the Growth and Stability Pact. And therefore there's a far greater role both at the national level and at the EU level as a response to the pandemic. But at the same time, they're using again, as it should be, I think, as a complement, an increased role for the European Investment Bank and the increasing national development banks. So I think it's good to understand the role of development banks as a complement to government action, and at the same time as working closely with the private sector. The one thing why it's attractive to governments, both in developed and in developing countries, is that it has valuable leverage. Because, for example, the paid-in capital of the EIB was doubled in the last decade, in 2012, by 10 billion euros. But the additional funding that was provided with that additional capital was 160 billion, because there is leverage, because the EIB funds itself in the capital market, lends jointly with the private lenders, co-finances with private investors, and so on. So this, for governments that want to do more, have to do more in the green transformation, in making a society more inclusive, in recovering from COVID, find this a very valuable tool, also from this point of view. So just very quickly, the roles that these development banks play. One is countercyclical, that is to lend more in crisis, whether it's a financial crisis or whether it's the current COVID crisis, when the private finance withdraws or increases very little, and there is a great need. The second role is to finance this structural transformation, particularly to a green economy. And thirdly, it has to, it can help with greater inclusion. And this is, of course, particularly important in developing countries or emerging economies like those of Latin America. And now, of course, we have, I think, a new challenge, which is interesting, but from an academic point of view, but difficult from them, is that at the same time, they are helping to fund the recovery, trying to help save jobs and help save companies from bankruptcy. But they're also trying to have this transition towards what is fashionable to call building back better. And that is, of course, difficult to do both at the same time. So if there's a company that is not particularly green, but big, it employs a lot of people, do you turn it down, or do you put a lot of conditions so that they become greener? And how do you do that in practice? So I think that's a difficult and complicated trade-off. So if I may, just 1 or 2 minutes, just on what I was going to do in my second part. What are the preconditions for these development banks to work quickly? I think one important one is that they need to be sufficiently large. In the countries that have done perhaps best in the world, like Germany and China, we see that they have very large development banks and that they have sufficient capital, and that therefore their impact, both on the counter-cyclical side and on the funding of the structural transformation, is very large. And an example, I think, which I like to give is that, for example, in Germany, the solar industry was really funded at the beginning solely by the German Development Bank, KfW. And then the private finance came in. And then it moved to China, and the Chinese Development Bank funded the growth of solar panels, of course, at massive scale, because China is a massive economy. They dramatically reduced the cost, which wasn't so nice for German or the American producers. Several of them went bankrupt. But it was a sort of global public good, because it managed to reduce the price or the cost of solar panels worldwide. In countries like Chile, solar energy has become extremely competitive with other sources of energy. But also worldwide. So this, if you like, is an important public good, which was partly started, or to an important extent started, by the actions of these development banks that assumed the initial financing risk. So the scale is very important. It's also important to have choose instruments which maximize development impact, because these institutions are different from commercial banks. Commercial banks have a simple aim. They have to maximize short-term profits. In the case of development banks, they also have to make profits, because governments don't want them to make losses. But their main aim is to maximize development impact. So you could say that they are profit makers, but not profit maximizers. And that the main challenge is how to channel their own funds and the funds of the private sector to go towards the sectors that are most dynamic, the greenest, and help in inclusion. So I think perhaps a final point also on the green subject, one of the conclusions from the conference we had linked to this summit of development banks was that, for example, to make these institutions greener, it's important that in every stage of the project and its financing, in every stage, whether it's evaluation, granting the loans, monitoring, clear green criteria have to be developed. And ideally, it also should be encouraged in the financial intermediaries or collaborators who co-finance these projects. So if I may, I would finish like this, and perhaps I took a little bit of too much time, for which I apologize. I look forward to your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Really, really interesting this this way the development banks have changed in some way during the times, and the role they can play in this actual challenge that we have as humanity. Thank you very much for your conference, for your speech. Now I want to introduce you Jenny Melo, who is our next speaker. Jenny Melo studied management and social science. Currently, she is finishing her PhD in rural sociology at the University of Missouri in the United States. She has spent her professional life as a consultant in Colombia and Latin America, and other countries of Latin America, understanding and supporting the relationship between business and society, looking to promote an inclusive development. She is co-founder of Huella Delta, a Colombian-based organization supporting rural communities in their links with the market. Thank you, Jenny, for being with us today.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Hi, everyone. Greetings from Colombia. I'm very happy for being here. As Gonzalo talked, I am the co-founder of Huella Delta. We are an organization based in Colombia. This organization combines two views. On the one side, a practitioner view and a more scholar view. This is the combination between my business partner and I. And this organization is a response to see how rural communities obtain poor gains from the market connections these days. And this is particularly evident in the Colombian context. I don't know if you know something of, have heard something in the news, but Colombia is always have lived in a complex situation from a historical standpoint of view. We have in this moment high rates of poverty, of inequality and exclusion. We are living the post-peace agreement, and also we are seeing an extractive use of biodiversity. We live in a country with so many assets in terms of biodiversity and the natural capital, but all these three things are being a bad combination. On the other hand, we are seeing significant opportunities to promote green businesses in this context. But we have poverty, exclusion, violence, The rural communities are in a bad situation, but also we have these big opportunities to create activities, economic activities in the context of the green economy. So we believe that the interaction between all these situations make urgent that we do an effort to create an inclusive green economy. I mean, the green economy is not inclusive per se, it's not inclusive by definition. We have to do an effort because of the inequality and the social structures surrounding a country as Colombia and other places in Latin America. So that's why we create this organization, and I'm going to take these other 5 minutes to explain the way in which we see how we can do real activities and practical activities to promote that this new green economy, that it could be inclusive. So we are a Colombian-based organization. We are a big corporation. Our aim is to support rural organizations to build relations with the market that are fair, inclusive, profitable, and sustainable. So to do this, we do 2 things. First, we understand the specificity of rural organizations. And second, we develop market paths in response to the specificity of each organizations. We work with organizations that follow four criteria. First, they have a business model that relate with biodiversity conversation, that somehow this rural activity is intertwined with biodiversity conversation, but also have productive activities in rural communities. It can be agricultural or non-agricultural, are led by the theories that are led by communities that are historically excluded, and their livelihoods are developed in the context of these social and economic exclusions. And finally, all these activities are promoting efforts in the context of peace building and well-being. So we work specifically with these organizations, and we do that with a specific understanding. As I said, it combines the view of a practitioner of working particularly with business and communities, but also from my experience as a scholar in rural sociology. So we build our understanding based on 5 ideas. The first is that the inequality surrounding the life of rural communities is expressed in these aspects that make their market access really difficult. So we can identify this aspect in a macro dimension. So if we want to promote inclusive business, we need to pay attention to the capitals that are available for the communities, their transaction cost, and the internal dynamics of their organizations. Second, through our endeavors, we can affect the ways in which communities engage with the market. So while we do that, we can influence the livelihoods of the community. So we see that if we affect how they engage with the market, we can affect their livelihoods and their well-being. The theory is that we need to understand the relationship between the rural economic activities and biodiversity, because there are so many trade-offs and tensions and things that we need to address. We cannot have a naive perspective saying, we can promote an agricultural activity and do not consider the potential implications in biodiversity terms. We need to find this point in which these 2 things can have a balance. And we believe that it is possible to develop commercial relationships that promote business that are sustainable and green. We believe that that's possible, but we believe that also that is full of nuances, trade-offs, tensions, and things we need to embrace and consider. And finally, when we support these rural organizations, we must acknowledge the specificity of each organization within specific places, within Colombia, or in the context of Latin America. I mean, it is not that we see inequality in Colombia, but also this inequality is expressed in different ways in different places of Colombia. We have more healthy, more wealthy places and more poorer places within Colombia. And so with this understanding, we what we do, we analyze business models with this view combining business, but also social aspects. We understand the value chains with the same dual perspective from this business perspective, but also understanding the power asymmetries within these value chains and the implications for the rural communities trying to do business in this context. And we develop paths that, like specific paths for specific communities that, I mean, in our effort to actually support. I mean, we try to do this last mile that there are so many consultants and other organizations doing an important work, like doing this diagnostic, but we believe that we need to work directly with companies. Like if we say this is a business opportunity, we have to go with them and support them and to accompany this process to see how many bad things can arise because of the consequences of these historical exclusions and these historical aspects that are there when we do business. So we are working this with this approach here in Colombia with communities that are living in rural areas, that are working in tourism, that are working with cacao and working with other products, with communities that are indigenous, with communities that they will involve in somehow in the peace agreement. And so we are trying this approach, and we believe that the action grounded in this approach will support economic activities that are, as I said, fair, inclusive, sustainable, and profitable. We believe that all these views, that it came from academia, but also with the practical side, that, I mean, we believe that we need to create a more deep conversation between academics and practitioners, like being sure that this rigor from academia is present, but also that these actions are practicable and create change at livelihood level for the rural communities. That's it. Thank you, Gonzalo.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Very interesting to have I will say a local based experience and local based experience in rural areas that are really important for Latin American development. So thank you very much for your presentation, for your speech. Stephanie shared with us a link to a recent paper. It's in the chat of the Zoom room, but also we are putting that on the chat of the Facebook Live and YouTube, where we are broadcasting this conference, this symposium. Now I want to introduce you our next speaker. That is Federico Ignacio Poli. Federico Ignacio Poli is an Argentine economist. He has been executive director of Argentina and IT at the Inter-American Development Bank. Here we have someone that works a lot on development banks, so probably it's going to relate something to what Stephanie had told us. Prior to this appointment, he has served as senior economic advisor at the Ibero-American Council of Productivity and Competitiveness from Paris. As a consultant for the private sector, national and regional governments in Europe and Latin America, and international organizations, and Development Bank of Latin America. Between 2006 and 2014, he was director of SEGIP, Economic Affairs Division in Madrid. Between 1996 and 2006, he held strategic positions in government and in the private sector in Buenos Aires and Argentina. He was general director of the industry of the government of the autonomous city of Buenos Aires and head of the Department of Economics and chief economist of the Argentine Industrial Union. He had a lot of different other places in the cabinet of the Ministry of the Economy of Argentina, and in the small medium enterprises also in regional development in Argentina. There's some other microphone on, but finally he writes papers in the newspapers in Argentina and Spain, and he has taught macroeconomics and trade integration in the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina, and the Catholic University, and the University of Barcelona. He has been a member of the Academic Council of the Argentina Industry Union for some years. Thank you, Federico, for being with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Sorry, Federico, something happened with the, maybe with the connection.
Yes, but now is back or not?
Oh, yes.
Federico, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes,
No.
Something strange with technology. Yeah. Don't worry.
Don't worry at all.
Okay. Sorry. Well, I would like to share some main basic concept that I think I could help us to discuss these important issues about the alternative development model in the region in the post-pandemic times. I will talk to you about what I consider the economic preconditions of the development models in any case. The first thing that we have to take into account is the difference between developed and in developing countries or underdevelopment countries. The needs of the underdevelopment countries are basically to foster the investment process to allow the diversification of the economic structure towards sectors with higher value added and the generation of employment in the private sector. I think that the dynamic sector of the economy is the private sector, which fosters the innovation process and the generation of employment, and the government have to generate the necessary condition for their development. For this purpose, it is necessary to fundamentally modify some of the economic foundations of our countries. I don't believe in one size fits for all, in particular in one region with the huge heterogeneity as Latin America. So I will refer in particular to the situation of Argentina. I advance to that my pessimistic point of view is based in the fact that Argentina suffers on a stagflation process for a decade, with the biggest level of inflation then after Venezuela, and the biggest drop in GDP in 2020 of all the region. So let me take 4 main points. The first one is, I think it's essential to compatibilize the weight of public spending in terms of GDP and the tax pressures on company in one side with the average productivity of the economy in the other side. If we don't do this task investment process. Let me show you some figures about Argentina. Argentina increased the aggregate public spending from 25% of the GDP on average in the period 1960-2000 to a level of 40% of GDP today. The most occurred in only 8 years between 2007 and 2015 in pre-pandemic times, and it was essentially current spending, not in public investment. The public employment, for example, especially in the subnational government, was double in 8 years in this period. The level of public spending imply level of tax pressure on companies incompatible with investment dynamics. The tax pressure in terms of GDP is 34%, but when you put aside the informal economy, the weight increased to reach 45% of the portion of the wealth generator that pays its taxes. The second point is about the necessary strengthen the business environment to ensure the entrepreneurs and companies who invest that they will be able to produce and to sell their products and services under the same rule of games and when they invest. What should be the rule became the exception in many countries of the region because of the fiscal voracity of government that increase the tax burden on companies when they see what they consider extra benefits in the private sector. This behavior, this government behavior, generate a big uncertainty in the business community who should invest. I understand the rationale behind this kind of government decision that try to relieve the social situation of the poor people, but I think that definitely is not the way. The third point, it's necessary to have a stable macroeconomic environment. That may sound strange today when the inflation is a problem of the past in the war, but I have to tell you that Argentina has been suffering level of inflation between 35% and 40% in the last years. The international experience shows that there are no growth with this level of inflation rates. And this phenomenon of inflation has a relationship with the many factors, but the main is the monetary financing of the fiscal disequilibrium that I mentioned before. And last but not least is the role of government to generate the conditions and to help to boost the private investment. I think that is fundamentally, not only in infrastructure, but also launching and accelerate investment packaging. In conclusion, I think that it's not possible to generate an investment dynamics, employment, good wages, and wealth if there is no growth. The private sector is the dynamic sector of the economy who fosters the innovation process and the generation of employment. The role of government to generate the condition is fundamentally. But without doubt, growth is the precondition that the region needs to start to discuss about alternative development models. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico, for this first statement and situating us in the reality of Argentina right now, which is quite complicated, as you have described it. The last presentation of the speech of this first round is going to be done by Annalisa Primi. Federico, I'm going to ask you to silence your microphone, please. Okay, thank you very much. As I was told, the last one is going to be done by Annalisa Primi. Annalisa Primi she's the head of the Economic Transformation and Development Division of the OECD Development Center in Paris. She advised policymakers in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the OECD on global trade, innovation, infrastructure, and industrial development. She shaped and created the OECD Initiative for Policy Dialogue on GVCs, Production, Transformation, and Development, and the Production, Transformation Policy Reviews. Prior to joining the OECD in 2009, she was associated economic expert at the United Nations Economic Commissions for Latin America and Caribbean, CEPAL in Chile, in Santiago, Chile. Her work focuses on the linkage between industrialization, innovation, and development, and on the role of the state in shaping development trajectories. She has extensive experience in target policy supports and technical assistance to developing countries, as well as a record of official and academic publications. Thank you, Annalisa, for being today with us. The floor is yours.
Hola, Gonzalo. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be with you. Good afternoon, good morning. First, I want to thank and congratulate Janji for the organization of this 4-day marathon that we are in day 2. And I want to say that it's extremely timely and important event, because in these times of emergency, I would say prolonged emergency that we are living through in this very challenging situation, I think it's so important to take the time to reflect on development prospects and not to forget that there is something beyond the response to the emergency that we need to think about. So I really want to thank the University of Ferrara, all the universities that are cooperating with Janji in these organizations and all of you. As an initial thought, I think it has been extremely interesting to follow the panel so far. And I'd say maybe what I'm going to say is going to complement a little bit the perspective that Francisco Gallego put on the floor in terms of the poverty issues and the importance of the evidence-based support. What Stephanie mentioned about the key role of the state in providing financing for development and sorry, there is a bit of noise where I am and I don't know how it will go away very soon. And what Federico mentioned about the preconditions for development and the fact that somehow a certain level of stability and possibility of macroeconomic management is needed when we want to think about development and economic diversification. I wanted to make 2 points. I really like, Gonzalo, what you mentioned about this. You're asking us in this panel to talk about institutions and tools. And so I want to try to make a point on institutions and then a point on tools in this first round. The premise that I wanted to make is that I'm entering into this analysis with a bias, which is that I am a real believer in the structural approach to development. I do think that what a country produces and how it trades and with whom it trades and what it trades really determines the possibilities of development for people. And I do think that when we talk about development, we are talking about industrial and manufacturing production and service delivery, and that it's not purely a social issue. And I do think that unfortunately, when we look at the challenges of Latin America and its development, if I look back at my Cepalino times and I think about the paper of Prebisch of 1949, Latin America and its principal problems, I am sorry to say that despite a lot of changes, a lot of those problems persist, despite the world has changed immensely. A big difference that I do see with respect to that analysis is, unfortunately, that the economic landscape is much less conducive to be optimistic about switching the prospects of disparity between the center and the periphery, because in the 1949, we were in a moment of building the multilateralism, of exiting a big crisis, and in times of preserving peace and supporting development. And now, unfortunately, we cannot avoid to think that we are discussing development cooperation and development partnerships in a context that is extremely tense internationally. And it's not discounted what will be the outcome of development and development alliances in such a tense environment. On the institutions, I'll use the same layers that Stephanie used, switch them in order. I think when we look at institutions and we look at development in Latin America, what I do see, and my colleagues from the region that know more about that can correct me, I do see three levels: the national, the regional, and the global. And on the national level, I think that somehow in the last decade or even 15 years, we can say that here and there, we have a lot of very nice, interesting, positive examples to share in terms of institutions that have been created, in terms of institutions that have been maintained, in terms of institutions that have been preserved from the willingness to try and diminish the role. I'm thinking of some of the national development banks. I'm thinking of the Chilean Corfo, that despite all the changes in government and very big swings in terms of political views, it's an institution that is there since the beginning of the century. It's operating, it's delivering. I'm thinking of Uruguay, that has been able to jumpstart into the digitalization, creating an agency that is worldly recognized as being capable of addressing the digital agenda. Uruguay capable of creating an innovation agency, which is kind of very agile and has been quite effective. So across the region, I do think that at the level of the national issues, we see a recognition that national strategies matter and that somehow governments need to do something. Now, not every country, Federico said it, Latin America, very heterogeneous. Not every country is equal and not every country has the same capacities. But let's say that there I am much more optimistic than how I was a couple of decades ago when I started to work with Latin America on development issues. Now, the other two levels is what worries me the most in terms of thinking of institutions and tools for a new development model. At the regional level, I feel, and it's not me, like it's evidence, if you look, Latin America is one of the latest integrated regions in the world. When you look at within regional trade, it's around 16% versus 60% of Europe and Asia. There is, of course, a reason behind that. It's a reason of economic specialization, and it's a reason in terms of political capacity to create institutions that are able to make trade integration work and trade integration work for production transformation. So there, I think that when we will look at what are the new options for Latin America and for development in the future, how do we work on the regional dimension and how do we make this dream of regional integration really working for Latin America? It's an open question. And I don't look at regional integration as a solution in the sense that it's easier to integrate regionally than globally. I don't think that. And I also don't think that we should look at regional integration as isolating the region. I think regional integration can be and should be, like for Asia and Europe, a powerful platform to change the relationship with the world and to integrate differently. And then I had the level of the global. At the global level, it's where I have even more worried about, because not only in this pandemic, we have seen that, let's say, the institutions that we have are still very important, but probably not so up to the challenges. It has been very difficult to coordinate multilaterally. We were not prepared for a simultaneous shock. We have rules for national emergencies. We don't have rules for international systemic emergencies. And this is something that maybe we can learn something on the financial side. We are used to global financial crisis. We were not used to real touching people simultaneous crises. So at the global level, I think we really need to have a reflection, and you that you're from the university, you're freer than us. I would really encourage you to help us thinking, how do we work on development when we have such a tense international environment? It's not an easy issue to deal with. And I do think that for Latin America, this is a big question, because who are the partners for Latin America? Who is the interlocutor that Latin America is going to put in the scene to have a dialogue with emerging Asia, with advanced traditional partners, with China, with Africa. Africa just signed a trade agreement. Okay, a lot of the issues are still in the pipeline. A lot of non-tariff barriers are not being resolved, but still, it's a progress that we don't see in the area of Latin America. And just in a minute to conclude, in terms of the instruments, when we look at the instruments, and if I focus on industrialization and industrial transformation and trade, 3 points. Instruments for what? And there, I think we can all agree that what we need is to diversify the region for a lot of reasons, not only for those of us that believe that it is good to diversify, it is good to enter into new areas, it is good to have homegrown innovations and national champions in Latin America, but also from simply what Francisco was talking about, which is the climate change challenge. The current specialization of Latin America for most of the countries is not helping a transition that will reduce globally the contribution of not only of emissions, but the transition to a sustainable economy. Even if you look at just a couple of countries that we work with national reviews, 50% of the exports of Chile are still copper, despite a major diversification, and a copper that is less refined than what it was before because of the change in the trade partners. Colombia, same, 50%. Oil, this is a trade and production specialization that goes against not only the increasing returns and learning and productivity, but also in terms of greening the economy. And the other issue where we do need instruments for is the increasing benefits from trade and investment. And there I want to say it's not a question of openness of the region, because countries in Latin America, many of them have done their job in openness. Chile has trade over GDP 60%, Mexico 75%. So it is not an issue of openness. It is of what you produce and what you export and with whom you relate. In terms of typology of instruments, what we have done in our work at the OECD with Manuel and Vasiliki, we do production transformation policy reviews. We have done one in Chile, one in Colombia, one in Dominican Republic in the region so far. We are discussing with Guatemala now. The instruments are too simple. So I think that there is an issue about developing a policy mix that is more complex and up to the challenges. Subsidies alone, they don't work. Purely fiscal incentives alone, they don't work. So we need to work a little bit more on the complexity and on the overall systemic interaction of the different instruments that exist. And I do support Stephanie's view that national and regional and international development banks, they should be a key player, and they should be allowed to use complex tools to deliver, to arrive to the beneficiaries. And with that, Gonzalo, I stop. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some ideas.
Thank you, Annalisa. Really, good to hear you. We have, for sure, there are a lot of comments and questions that we want to share with this panel after this first round of interventions. So to start this question round, in this round table, I want to introduce to you, I know almost everybody here knows him, but I want to introduce Professor Gianfranco Franz. He's professor of the Department of Economics and Management of the University of Ferrara, co-founder of the University Network Roots Towards Sustainability, and have had a lot of work in Latin America as well as in Europe in different aspects of development. So Professor Franz is going to start the questions for this round. So Professor Gianfranco Franz.
Thank you, Gonzalo, and thank you to all our panelists today. And I thank you all the people following this seminar, and especially our students from the PhD in environmental sustainability and well-being for their commitment. So I suggest the students to also to make some questions to some of the, if you have some input or suggestions from the many ideas we received today. Yes, I have really I have at least one question for every lady in the panel today, and probably I can put on the table this question from Ana Barrera. I think it would be interesting to know which programs and tools the ULAC Foundation can promote, especially in the educational field. This is very important also for the next, for the follow-up in the future of this experience. And to Annalisa Primi, I think you wrote something very interesting about the role of women in trying to achieve a good development, a fair development. But also there is another aspect that is important to take in consideration today during the pandemic, the dependency of many emerging countries, but also rich countries as in Europe, France, Italy, or Spain, Japan. We are not able to produce vaccines, and this is absurd. And what means to develop, to promote an industrial policy just to try to solve this situation for the next pandemic, because we know that due to the environmental disaster we are producing, we will suffer for sure some other pandemics. And to Stephanie, it would be interesting to. My position is that finance could be an obstacle for development, for a good development, and sometimes could be also useful. But in emerging countries, finance can create some disaster bigger than in rich countries. So, how do you see the role of green finance to promote a better development? And finally, to Jenny Melo, I loved her presentation about the big corporation, etc. And how do you think, Jenny, that firms and companies can support the goal of the integral development? I was mixing all the question because probably each of you can have some suggestions and ideas also in other fields and topics.
Thank you, Gianfranco. I want to add one question to Francisco, who is going to leave in a few minutes. So I want him to answer first. In the idea of the what you have show us about JPAL, it's very interesting. This map with a lot of dots that are actually different questions and different research that it had been done all over the world, and the role of the university in this case. Many times they stuck at the university level and don't get into the action, as you told me, and in the real action at government or at subnational level. So how do you communicate all these this evidence that you have been founded in all over the world to international organizations in one part and to national governments and policymakers to make them happen at the local level?
Okay, so, sorry, Gonzalo. We have one question from a student, a Brazilian student. We can put on the table, and then we start from Professor Gallego?
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Do you have it?
Carmen de Souza Marcon.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, well, I actually have a question from Facebook. It's the issue in Europe floats around how the financial system will finance energy transition when Latin America struggles with poverty, biodiversity preservation versus agriculture for exporting, mining, and inflation. So inequality seems still an issue, maybe financing Latin America to overcome these basic issues would turn them to make an energy transition later. Well, it's just some ideas about what it has been talked by now by many of you, and yes, feel free to answer.
Thank you very much. So we're going to start this round with Professor Gallego. We're going to follow the same structure. You can also comment on the, for sure, you can comment on the other presentations, because this is the idea of the round table. You can speak about what others have already said also. Professor Francisco Gallego.
Okay, thanks a lot. Very interesting question. I would say that, like, you know, it is, well, you know, Stephanie also and other people here in this roundtable has experiences on this, but I would say that it is the consequence, the communication from like research to the policy, you know, realm and NGOs, etc., and society, you know, it's a consequence of many years of work first and investing, you know, etc. And I would say that there is a very important role for like having an interface between research and reality or policy or etc., where you have people who have human capital needed to do this. And sometimes or many times people in academia, you know, are busy in other things or don't have the human capital to do that. So I think it's very important in JPAL, you know, which is having like a group of people working actually on this jointly with like professors, you know, and people doing research. That's the first point. The second point, which I think is very interesting and it has been my experience, is that, you know, when you start like interacting with governments, you start asking new research questions. And I think that's very important, you know, and that's like, you know, in a sense, in that sense, there is no trade-off between like doing like research and policy outreach, because when you start doing policy outreach and you start collaborating, we collaborate a lot with international institutions and governments, you know, you start with new questions, you know. And actually, I would like to mention on education, something that Gianfranco asked Anna. You know, there is a recent report by the panel organized by the World Bank and DFID, you know, where basically they suggested a bunch of policies, what they call like cost-effective policies to improve education in different like middle and low-income countries. And that panel, I think, reflects, you know, very well how like academia, governments, you know, NGOs, and society, you know, could share their knowledge and produce, you know, everybody, you know, bringing their experiences, you know,
produce a bunch of recommendations. And so that would be my answer to your question, Gonzalo. I think it's like it's something that has to be done, and it's not done by by chance or by just you start one day and you do the stuff, and you but it can be done, And finally, I would like to comment a little bit on just a second on the conversation. I think that on development economics and on how to face the challenges that we face, that has been very well described before, I think we have to take like what I call an and approach, or not an or approach, in a sense of like doing like either empirical, rigorous development economics analysis, or taking a more structural approach, which I myself was trained, joining the two ways. On one side, I do stuff in JPAL, but at the same time, I do research related to what Daron Acemoglu and other people have been working on, like the role of historical stuff on institutions today. And and I was in a department where people were fighting basically the two camps. And to me, in the end, it is that you need both camps. You need very well done, empirical evidence, with about a bunch of micro policies, because we might have like the right institutions or right structure in the economy, but if we don't know how to get to the last mile of the policies, we're not going to do anything. But at the same time, if we just think that the policies are, implemented, without considering the incentives created by institutions, by history, we're not going to probably, have good policies. So my view, and I think this panel reflects very well that, that it is very important at this stage, we face really relevant challenges, to take an and approach, So basically, it's not either or, it's and, it's both, Let's do stuff, we face relevant challenges, and the important thing is we can complement each other. So thanks a lot. I'm sorry for leaving.
Thank you, Professor Gallego. Thank you for joining us, for your reflections on all these issues, really important for us. The PhD student and one of the organizers of this event, Caterina Rondoni, is going to make a question for Federico, and then we're going to give the chance to Stephanie that she can explain us her comments on that. No, sorry, maybe we're going to do it in the other way. First, Stephanie, you have the word. You can answer and you can speak, and then Caterina is going to make another question for you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I also will have to leave, but maybe I would like to say something on what Francisco just said, to comment on that, because I think he's very right to have an or approach. For example, in this discussion about states or markets, in Latin America and also in Europe, we spend a lot of time debating these things. And the Asians don't seem to worry so much about these debates. They just combine the states and the markets to work together most effectively for development. I'm simplifying a little bit, but they're much less, if you like, ideological. And I think the idea they have is to try and get the best from both. And this is a little bit the approach that with Jose Antonio Campo we've tried to take when we study development banks, because there was a lot of people, saying, oh, development banks are marvelous, and there's still some. And they're always better. And then there are others who say, no, they're rubbish because, private financial markets by definition are more efficient. And that is not really a very helpful approach. I think the important thing is to think about what are the best interactions, the most productive interactions in terms of development, what are the best institutions, the best tools, and so on. So I think that's quite important. And there's a lot of work to do on this. How can you, for example, involve the private sector finance in ways that are most beneficial for development? Not necessarily so they make maximum profits, which is what they want to do, but also to help maximize development. And how, for example, the instruments that development banks can articulate and design are useful for that too. Very specifically, for example, a private sector likes to have lots of guarantees because they, this is market economy, the capitalist system, but they don't like to take risk. And so the more risks are taken by governments or public development banks, the happier they are. And then the fashionable expression to use is de-risking, which means basically it's not correct. It means that they want that the public sector takes the risk and the private sector takes the profits. So what are the formulas whereby governments can take sufficient risks to encourage private sector to invest, but not take so much of the risk that they will then later make massive losses? So I think that's the kind of finer analysis which I think we need. And Gianfranco asked a very interesting question about finance in developing countries versus developed ones, and then about green finance. I mean, I think what the so-called global financial crisis, which was basically a North American and a European crisis, 2008, 2009, showed was that, in fact, we can't really distinguish that the problems of private finance are intrinsic and are not dependent on the level of development. So, there was this idea that Latin American or other developing countries would graduate, that their financial systems would become as close as possible, if you like, to the developed ones, particularly Anglo-Saxon ones, and everything would be fine. And all these crises they had were just because they managed things badly, because the markets weren't deep enough, and so on. But then, in 2008, we had this crisis, which happened in the biggest economy, the richest one, and the one with the deepest financial market. So that showed us that the problems were deeper, that it wasn't just a question of graduating. And when we had the Eurozone crisis, Greece had a decline of GDP of 25%, which was bigger than any Latin American or African country has had as a result of a financial crisis. So it sort of, that was not just the crisis itself, but the way it was managed. So this is, I think, a broader problem. And the solutions, I think, therefore, are not so different. Of course, they are different in the sense that markets are less developed, the needs are bigger in emerging and developing countries. One of the students asked a question about energy, for example. Yes, in Africa, it's not just about green energy, it's about having electricity in all the villages and for all the poor people in the cities. And so they have a double challenge. They have to green the supply of energy, but they also have to expand it because they need energy for people and for production as well. I think in terms of green finance, I think that is a very important topic. I personally believe that the role of development banks like Corfo in Chile and KfW in Germany and so on, it is very crucial. But they have to mobilize the private finance. And so I think one of the challenges is how to do that while being able to channel the private finance towards the sectors that have the highest priority. So you have to have this kind of mission-oriented policy steer attitude, but at the same time you have to incentivize the private sector. So it's a very fine balancing act for governments, development banks, and the private sector to do it together. I think, for example, the EU has an interesting approach because they have a taxonomy, and it's not perfect, but they try and define what are the criteria. Then they use this taxonomy to influence how decisions are taken in the European Investment Bank and in the national development banks. they have specific tools, like they use the carbon price, the shadow carbon price of to evaluate projects, which is now 300 euros per ton of carbon, which is much higher than the market price. And then they try and encourage the private sector through incentives, through subsidies, through guarantees, to go into greener projects and to discourage them or not finance intensive in fossil fuel and so on. So these are, I think, very complex topics. And how do you finance if it's less profitable? Do you give subsidies? Do you give guarantees? So it's a very complex issue, and I think it's very important to always have your eye on the ultimate goal, which is this urgent green transformation, an inclusive one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Really, really great to hear you. Really, 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 really interesting for us. I want to give the microphone to Ana Barrera if you want to answer some of the questions that Gianfranco told us.
Thank you very much. Just adding up on what Francisco and Stephanie were saying, yes, I agree entirely that it is not an either-or question. Also in the field of education and research, it's looking also what is already there. This is, for example, also one of the tasks of the EULAC Foundation. There is a huge production output on studies, analysis, and it is very difficult for any student of international relations to really to get a view of interesting and relevant literature. So, for example, a very simple instrument that the EULAC Foundation has developed ever since its beginning is it's a digital library that all of you can access, and actually we get a lot of feedback from students, doctoral students, researchers, that it is a very helpful tool because you will find studies there on the issues that we are just discussing, which are related to integral development, from health, passing through education, towards climate change, technology transfer, etc., etc. So I can, of course, share with you the link, but also at the same time invite all of you to share with us literature, which is open access, because this is a living tool, and which lives on from all the input that are provided to us from researchers, institutes, practitioners from all over the world, basically. Also, in terms of mapping what is already there, because it's impressive what is already there, the EULAC Foundation has developed a document which is called the Matrix of Objectives and Strategic Lines of which are all geared towards the construction of a common bi-regional space for higher education between Latin America, the Caribbean, and the European Union. We have engaged for 2 years in the process of dialogue with different associations, university associations, academic associations, bi-regional ones, but also regional or sub-regional ones, who are debating, dialoguing about what are the things in common, what is needed to bring us more closer together, to recognize, for example, titles mutually, to facilitate mobility between staff, etc., to conduct where are the opportunities to conduct joint research ventures. And the result of it is a matrix, which we also have just just updated and which is disposable on our website. And this is a continuous process. So it also lives from inputs that all universities, associations, academics, their networks are providing to us. We are also visibilizing and diffusing information on ongoing initiatives. For example, last October, the senior officials which are working on higher education, research, innovation, and technology between both regions have convened and agreed on a roadmap which is comprehensive and which entails different pillars. For example, mobility, research infrastructures, and addressing jointly common challenges. Again, we come back to topics like health, to environment, to digitalization. This roadmap is just about to being adopted by all of the European countries, and it will be a sort of roadmap which will count with specific venues of financiation, specifically from Horizon Europe, in order to being implemented. And what is the role of the EULAC Foundation is simply diffusing this information and also convening interested actors in the ministries for science and technology, among the researchers and associations of academics who are interested in taking advantage and taking this as an opportunity to jointly address one of those issues which are there and for which just by now there are being opened funds, which we find very, very important. And of course, we also implement own activities. We, from time to time, publish different calls. These may be calls for essays. These may be calls for analysis and studies. This may be calls for joint events of academic nature, or of seminars where the idea is to transfer knowledge towards the political level. And right now we are, for example, we have opened an essay contest which is directly directed to scholars, to students, about good ideas on how the both regions, Latin America, Caribbean, and the European Union, could work together towards a greener recovery of our systems. We also will, in the upcoming months, we will publish and then discuss in a seminar a study which is being written by a consortium of different universities on how to better on policies geared towards the better inclusion of women in the labor markets in the context of the pandemic. We will also hold a seminar where we will listen to research outputs on how social security systems in Latin America and the Caribbean could be improved in order to facilitate full coverage, universal coverage of health for the entire populations. And we will also be inviting experts who will be thinking about how to, for example, provide all those informal workers in Latin America and the Caribbean who all make up about 50% of all the employed or working population in Latin America, how these people could access social security, which is also very, very important. We also are conducting an initiative looking or spotlighting the tourism sector. There are countries in both of our regions, for example, the Caribbean region, but also several European countries, whose GDP depends heavily on the tourism sector. So our question, and we will invite researchers and academics also to deal with this, is not only what was the impact of the pandemic, but rather how can the tourism sector recover in a sustainable way? How can new innovative models of sustainable tourism be implemented in those countries that are very, very much depending on income from this sector, but also who have an environment that is very, very vulnerable to different kind of crises. And finally, jointly with important partners such as the OECD, such as ECLAC, such as the European Commission, since several years, the EULAC Foundation has been promoting a different approach towards development, which is called development in transition. I'm sure all of you have heard of it. The concept of development in transition has specific importance for Latin America and the Caribbean because the majority of those countries are already attaining higher income levels. But still, they are struggling with structural challenges, which are really, really difficult to address. These challenges relate, for example, to poverty, to inequality, to a very heterogeneous structure of production, to, in part, limited capacities for innovation or low levels of diversification, and also for vulnerable institutional and financial frameworks, as we have all discussed. So while countries make efforts to address those vulnerabilities and also whilst addressing the burden that has now increased because of the pandemic, they also face global challenges such as climate change. And this is a heavy burden for many of those middle-income countries. And this development in transition approach is precisely geared towards how to make sure that in this complex field, states will be still capable of attaining the Sustainable Development Goals, which is really, really a challenge. But I think it is worth a try. And in this endeavor, of course, all the contributions that can be made by innovative research, studies, analysis, and inputs from academia, from the higher education sector, are really, really welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I was thinking about the and. When we talk about development in transition, we don't have to choose between development and the environment. We have to do both at the same time. So it's probably part of what the main issue in this idea of integral development, that we have to do more things at the same time to be able to go to a better way of life, a better life for everybody. Katerina is going to ask the question to Federico so he can think a little bit about it, and then we continue this round with Jenny. But Katerina first.
Good afternoon and good morning. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Actually, I have a couple of questions to put on the table. One is for Professor Poli, and I think that can also be addressed to Jenny Melo if she wants to answer. And is about the role of small medium enterprise on the idea of the integral development, but also on the idea of change the paradigm of economics. I mean, how can they do something to help our goals? And the other is related to the one of the main goals of the symposium, that is the interconnection and the interchange between Europe and Latin America. Because unfortunately, I noted during this year of studying that the interest of Europe in South America and Latin America in general is a bit like low. And I think that is quite important if we want to develop a new economic paradigm because of the root of Latin America. It's really important to exchange ideas and exchange work and exchange experience. So basically the question is how we can restoring the interest of Europe on Latin America and open again this channel of exchange. And I think that I can address the question to Ana Barrera, but if the other one want to answer too. Thank you very much, Gonzalo.
Thank you, Caterina. For sure, later Anna can also relate it to that question. I want to give the microphone now to Jenny, if you want to address some of the issues that we have been discussing here.
Yes, of course. Yes, I think we need to consider the role of businesses in building these new, these alternatives to economic, these sustainable development possibilities. And I think the role of businesses is absolutely fundamental. But I think we also need to see the nuances and the possibilities. And I think the first thing to advance, to build partnerships with the with all kind of businesses is to recognize the power asymmetries and imbalances between the communities, the government, and the companies. And that implies to acknowledge that not all the companies are the same. I mean, I'm hearing the feedback. Okay. One thing are the multinationals, would have a different scope and different possibilities, and they have a different repertoire of things that they can do to improve sustainable development because of the range of investments that they are able to. And that's one conversation. And because in this conversation is the level of accountability that we have to ask for these kind of businesses when they are involved in sustainable development efforts. On the other hand, we have the small and medium enterprises that are absolutely crucial in places as Latin America. And in the context of COVID, these companies are being the most affected for this new situation. So I think we have to build different conversations, seeing the losers and the winners in the pandemic situation from a business perspective, and to ask for different kind of engagement. I think my point is that we have to ask a specific thing to a specific businesses because the responsibilities that they have and the spectrum of possibilities of actions are different for all these companies. In the specific context of small and medium companies in places as Colombia, in the context of pandemic, I think we have to build this connection between the local communities, the workers, and these companies to strengthen these value chains, trying to reproduce the value and to contain the value in these places, because the pandemic has affected these countries and these communities in a really harsh way. So I think in an endeavor to build inclusive and green businesses, we have to pay more attention to see how we can build this connection between communities and between these small and medium enterprises on the one hand, and on the other, to see what are the endeavors that we can, in which we can engage to these multinational, in these big companies, in order to talk about green recovery or talking about climate change initiatives. Because as I say, the scope of their possibilities is different. So I think the conversation it should be different in spite of the actors that are involved. And from a sociological point of view, and from the perspective of Huella Delta, we believe that the imbalances and the power asymmetries are real, are there, and the first step to build partnership is to embrace it. I mean, is to acknowledge and to put these differences on the table and to build from that what are the best ways in which we can relate together. Because it's naive to not acknowledge that if for example, you bring community organization to be part, to engage in the value chain with a big corporation. I mean, it's good for both sides, but of course, there are some winners and losers. There's the the effects are different for those actors. So we believe that if we really want to build an inclusive and green economy, we have to pay more attention to the way in which these benefits are being distributed. And that's a conversation about the imbalances of access and the access for different actors and the assets that they bring to the table.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for your reflection on this issue, on this imbalance and the role of business. I think it's really important. I want to give now the microphone to Federico about all the things that we have been discussing here. And probably one of the other things that I want to add is what Europe can learn about the Argentinian process and Latin American. We are now in Chile. We are in a situation in which we are rethinking really an important part of our institutionality. So maybe there are some things that we can also learn from the Argentinian experience to reframe our institutionality. Federico.
Okay. Thank you for the question. First of all, I refer the relation between Latin American and the European Union. To do that, let me briefly refer how is drawing the big picture of international relationship and the role of Mercosur. After Trump, the geopolitical dispute between United States and China continues to show us that's a structural issue related to the struggle for the raw materials and the technological race. Definitively, it wasn't a Trump issue. And China has become the main buyer of raw material of the Mercosur, but it's not a market for our product or high value added services. Instead, our countries already maintain some intra-industrial trade with United States and Europe, additionally the intra-region trade. I would like to highlight one of the most important news in the international scenario, the refreshed alliance between Europe and United States of America, based in a big push for the private sector from the public spending. The EU has launched a package of 750 billion euros. They represent the 5% of the GDP in loans and grants called Next Generation EU to help especially the resilience and recovery process of the economies. The EU says that this is more than a recovery plan. It is one in a lifetime chance to emerge stronger from the pandemic, transform our economies, create opportunities and jobs for the Europe where we want to live. Coupled with this Next Generation EU, the temporary instrument designed to boost the recovery, the EU long-term budget be the largest stimulus package ever financed in Europe. A total of 1.8 trillion euros will help rebuild a post-COVID-19 Europe. They hope that it will be a greener, more digital, and more resilient Europe. By the American side, the White House announced the launch of the American Jobs Plan, that consists in an investment plan in America that they hope it will create millions of good jobs, rebuild the country's infrastructure, and position the United States to outcompete China. Revitalize manufacturing, secure US supply chains, invest in research and development, and train Americans for the job of the future. They will invest about 1% of the GDP per year over 8 years. The plan will invest about $2 trillion this decade. Well, when you compare this with the policies that Brazil and Argentina put in the table, the divergences are bigger and bigger. But in the case of Mercosur, I think that it's essential to move forward with an agreement with the European Union, because all the subregions of Latin America, Central America, and Mexico, and the Pacific area have agreement not only with Europe, also with United States of America and Japan. Unlike this, Mercosur hasn't agreement with anyone. We can say that Mercosur countries are close between them, but nevertheless, thanks to this system, has some preferences along the continent countries, the Latin American countries. There's no other economic region as big as Mercosur, which has no any regional agreement. As said, unfortunately, Argentina and Brazil don't have to capacity today to launch program as we are seeing in United States and EU. Obviously, I am not referring the size, but the kind of program. So while both Europe and United States are launching huge programs in order to improve the infrastructure, to boost the innovation, and to renew the economic structure to face the new challenges of the private sector, unfortunately, Mercosur countries struggle with old problems and increase the big diversions that separate one region from the other. Related to the role of the SMEs in the construction of a new development model, well, I think that is fundamentally the role of the SMEs due to many causes. First of all, because they are who generate the employment in the region and allow the regional equilibrium into the countries. But not only this, the SMEs was the main actor of the economic structure, and it's not possible to think about value chains without a big company, but the million of SMEs. So, well, that is my reflection about this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you for pointing us the extremely gap between what Europe, US, and probably China is doing with this recovery process, and Latin America. I have to say that I feel a little depressed from that. I want to give the microphone to Annalisa Primi. What do you can share with us in terms of this conversation?
Thank you, Gonzalo. And we arrived to the end, I think, of a very dense, I learned a lot. I wanted to try to answer the question that Gianfranco posed me about the reaction to the pandemic and the dependency or not in terms of pharmaceutical and healthcare capacities. If we bring the discussion to that point, what I think we are seeing is what a lot of us have been arguing, that Latin America can and should strengthen their manufacturing and research capacities. We have been publishing reports showing the asymmetry in terms of industrial capacities and in terms of research investment efforts. And now we have the proof that globally we have seen that there is too much concentration in terms of healthcare systems, both in terms of technology, in terms of investment research, in terms of networks of professionals, and in terms of manufacturing capabilities. Now, I do think that we are seeing an opening. I don't like to call crisis opportunities, because here also we're talking about people's life, but let's say that there is an opening for opening a little bit more policy space for industrializing Latin America and other areas of the world, in particular Africa and emerging Asia, in a key area which is related to the industrial, scientific and technological healthcare complex. On this aspect, I think that I don't have the figures for Latin America, you know better, but I've been working on this with Africa and with the United Nations Commission for Africa. We released a note back in June last year advising that we needed to think about how you deploy and how do you vaccinate the whole world before the vaccine were discovered. And we were calling, I will share with you the paper, we called for a lift on IP, but also for technology transfer and industrialization efforts. I think that the negotiations ongoing on now at the WTO on the IP waiver should be used not only to address the emergency. And now, of course, we have an emergency. It's a self-interest to say we have to vaccinate the world, because if we need the global economy running, we need to vaccinate everybody. It's not for equity. It's not for goodwill. There is an economic reason behind, and this is why we can be sure that we will do the best to do that. Now, for me, the development concern is what's beyond the emergency, and how can we use the negotiations that are happening now to ensure that we try to climb that famous letter that everyone was talking about in terms of creating manufacturing and technology capacities in emerging economies. And I want to say why this would be good. If you look about Africa, Africa imports 98% of the pharmaceutical needs, and they import 94% of the medical instruments. And of the 94% of the medical instruments that they import, only around 9% comes from within the continent and mostly from South Africa. For a continent that is home to 1/5 of the world population, this is excessive dependence. I'm not arguing that manufacturing and technological capacities are equally distributed around the globe. We know there are poles of excellence, and of course, actors will be concentrated in certain areas and within certain firms. It's a very concentrated market. But definitely it is a little bit too much. And if we use this opportunity that we have now to scale up research and technology and manufacturing capacities in Latin America, in Africa, and in emerging Asia, we can strengthen the world for the future. Because if you do good healthcare research and healthcare manufacturing in a place, this is a little bit like science, it's good anywhere. And we do need definitely better responses. Chile made a commendable effort. You released very recently ProSalud. It's a public-private partnership that will support actually the creation of research and manufacturing poles in Chile, but also in the region. And I think that there are interesting things happening that we should be monitoring and supporting. On this, we will have actually a session organized by the OECD. I have a global dialogue on production transformation and value chains. And on the 7th of July, we're going to have a session. We ask the president of ProChile to join us to have a debate about the IP waiver and the ongoing negotiations at WTO. I think I know it's a very conflictive area, and I do have a personal opinion. I don't have an official position of the OECD to share, but my personal position is that, of course, we need the IP waiver. There are too many conflicting IP issues on every single vaccine. People think it's one thing that you need to lift. There is a million of them. It's a jungle of IP, of patents issued, because there is the components, and there is the different parts of the components and the processes. So, of course, for an efficiency reason, the IP waiver, if we need to go quicker with the vaccination, it's needed, but it's not enough. And not only technology transfer, but business sharing practices. How do we scale this up? How do we enable that manufacturing vaccine is possible? It's very different from drug manufacturing. Not every pharmaceutical company can do that. It's not a chemical process, it's a biological process. So we need to know which institutes and firms can do this in developing countries, and we need to enable them to do it. And on a more longer term, I think that there is a big issue in terms of the regulation. This is a very regulated industry, and we do want the safety and insurance to be. We don't want to have a vaccine like a quality A and quality B. We have to have top quality anywhere and everywhere for everybody. So there is a strong call, at least on our side, for a multilateral cooperation on the regulation processes, so that we can speed this up and ensure that we advance and we strengthen regulatory capacities in this field in Latin America. And as I'm saying, there are interesting things happening, and there are very important institutions. In Brazil, there is the Fiocruz, Colombia has capacities. So I think on this, Latin America can really step up, and the cooperation with Europe in this area is particularly important, because nobody can do this alone. And the networks, even between the universities, are particularly important. I leave it here, and I really thank you for the possibility to be with you today.
Thank you, Annalisa. Great your comments to share with us. I want to, we have more or less 10-15 minutes more to go, and I want to ask if any of the PhD students that are here want to ask some questions to our panelists. We can open the microphone if there's some question from the PhD students of environmental sustainability and well-being of the University of Ferrara that are joining us. If there's or anybody else from the audience that are here in the Zoom session or by the YouTube or Facebook Live. If not, I want to offer a last round of final remarks or final comments to each one of the panelists who have been with us today. So we can start with Anna, and there was also this question by Caterina about the, as she mentioned in our last meeting in last week, the panelists mentioned this decline of the interest of Europe in Latin America because they have shift to other interests. So maybe you can comment something on that, or anyone you want to add to this session. Anna.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo, and Caterina also for the question. It's not an easy question. I guess several years earlier on, we had this very, very well established one major channel, which were the summits of heads and state and government of the EU and CELAC countries. which a little bit calmed down in the last years, because mainly due, for example, on the CELAC side of internal conflicts and also institutional weaknesses of CELAC, which simply does not have the same institutional infrastructure and is not of the same juridical nature as the EU institutions are. So the dialogue has been rather channeled through those formal and informal meetings of foreign ministers. And I would respond that the importance is that we, from the positions where we are, being researchers, being employees at foundations, at non-governmental organizations, at governmental organizations, we put our knowledge and our ideas together and make positive lobbying to address them and take them by their word. For example, in December last year, at the informal meeting of foreign ministers of all Latin American, Caribbean, and European countries, ministers stressed the need to jointly address the challenges of the pandemic, which are multidimensional. Thus, the EULAC Foundation organized in March a two-day event on instruments for financing and for distributing in an equitable manner the vaccines against COVID-19, and with specific focus on middle-income countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, because their access to vaccines is not as easy as low-income countries, which receive more directly vaccines through the COVAX initiative and other means. And we invited, for example, Alicia Bárcena from ECLAC and the High Representative for Foreign Affairs of the EU, Josep Borrell. Both came. They looked into their eyes virtually and they shared ideas. And with those ideas and recommendations and voices from Latin America, Mr. Josep Borrell was better equipped to then have negotiations within the EU how to deal with this matter towards the Latin American and Caribbean region. So also, the point is to take them by their word when they have joint communiques, when they emit some sort of an announcement, and deal with it. Engage political decision makers, provide them with evidence-based scientific results, and also good practices from the grounds, good practices as have been, for example, today presented by Jenny Melo Velasco, right? Because it is all linked, the local level, the regional level, with the intergovernmental level. And I think all of us can contribute to it. And if we join our forces and convene on 2-3 prioritized topics, and then call their attention, the state's attention to those topics, and remind them that if we act jointly, 61 states, this is a third of the entire constituency of United Nations. We have really a weight also on a global level. And I think we have to remind them on that. And we also need to be aware that our societies share much more than perhaps commercial relations. We share principles and values. And this is why, for example, in Europe, we are moved when, for example, a hurricane is devastating a Caribbean island, or when, for example, there are social protests that are being answered with violence in Colombia. Or when there's trees and trees and trees burning in the Amazon. this is moving for the people in Europe, and vice versa. There is a lot of interest of different kinds from Latin American and Caribbean citizens to different ongoing initiatives, processes, models, policies in Europe. And we share a lot of interest on various levels, and I think this is the really a treasure that we have, this mutual interest which lasts for decades, for centuries, and which is based on values such as our conviction of the importance of dignified human life in balance with the environment. And I think this is something that we need to stress.
Thank you very much, Anna. Jenny, do you want to make some final remarks?
Yes. Yeah, I think just to talk about the relevance to create this flow of conversations between scholars and academics, and not only the conversation, but also to identify the ways in which we can work together, the ways in which this create value for both. Because as a person that I am present in both worlds, I know the constraints and the clash of interest and goals somehow because of this, the structures in which we are working. I think to create this conversation is crucial, but in a more structured way in which the scholars can have, can develop their work in the context of this partnership. I think that's a crucial thing which we have to work because of the current situation. I think the pandemic and all the things that is happening in these days, it urges us to reflect in our paths, in the actions that we are conducted, and it is also an opportunity to identify new possibilities and new ways to work with others. We know that we have to work with others in order to expand our capacity. I think it's a moment to go beyond and to actually start to create these bridges and to work together and to try different initiatives in benefit of the most affected communities in Latin America, in Colombia, and in the world. So that's my final remark, Gonzalo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Federico, do you want to make some final remarks on this conversation?
Okay, Gonzalo, thank you very much. I think that there's no doubt that the world goes toward a greener and more sustainable economy because the effects of the climate change. So government and consumers, especially of the developed world, pressure companies to make greener products. In the case of EU, for example, they are included clauses in this sense into the commercial agreement with the emerging economies. I think that in this field, the worst scenario is one in which developed economies ban the import of no green products and close their market for them. Because the transition toward the decarbonized economy is expensive, because imply the changing of technology, and additionally it will take times. The economies and the companies of the developing countries need resources and finance. One of the main sources of resources is the trade. The other one is the foreign direct investment. It's clear that the developing countries will go to the target slower than the developed countries, and in the meanwhile, they will need the openness of market of developed countries for their products. So it should avoid restriction or import ban in the export market for the companies of developing countries. In the case of FDI, it's necessary for developing countries to develop a clear strategy to attract it, especially the kind of FDI that help us to improve our green goals. Finally, as Stephanie mentioned, the international and regional and national development banks has an important role to play. Developed countries should increase the fund to improve the conditions of loans for financing the transition of the economies of the developing countries toward greener economy. That's my point. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you for your comments, and for sure we had a lot to go in this way of recovering our economies. Finally, I think Annalisa have left the room. I don't see her.
Yes, Annalisa went, unfortunately.
Okay, so
yes.
I want to
she apologized, of course.
Professor Gianfranco Franz, if you want to make some final remarks on this.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Very quickly, I love this seminar, this section, and it was really full of input statements and reflections on many arguments. Above all, of course, development, but we are looking for a different or new adjectives for development, and we today received a lot of inputs. I think very useful, especially for the students, our young researcher, and because the challenge is for them. So I want to really thank you, all our guests, and for sure, just before leaving the floor to Gonzalo, I'm sure that we will work in the next months just to consolidate this experience that was an experiment, and was an experiment invented by Caterina and suggested by Caterina, and then we were working just to realize it. So it works, and now we have to imagine how to continue, if and how to continue. Thank you very much, Gonzalo, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Gianfranco.
Gianji, please.
Gianfranco. I said Gianfranco.
Gianfranco, yes.
Oh, Gianji, okay. Thank you, Gianji. I also want to thank you, all of the panelists who have been with us today. I think that we had a really, really interesting, almost 3 hours conversation on the issues of that we need to address if we want to go to a new kind of development, an integral development, or and how we do it in a collaboration way with different institutions, with the different ways of research, with the private sector, with businesses, with foundations, with universities, with governments, and with international agencies and organizations. This is part of what we have been talking about in these 3 hours, and part of the this symposium that is going to continue next Wednesday with local experiences in Latin America. It's going to be experiences on different countries of Latin America of how they are building different ways of development at local level with local organizations and communities. So everybody is invited to next Wednesday to the third day of the symposium. And in the following Wednesday, it's going to be the fourth day in which we will talk about circular economy and the challenge for development, for integral development and circular economy. So thank you very much to everybody who has been joining us today for this day of symposium. We're gonna finish it here. We're gonna stop the online session. If you can remain just 1 minute, I will to a few words later. I will. It would be good. So thank you very much, and to next Wednesday. Bye bye. Caterina me avisa cuando hayamos terminado la transmisión.
Un ratito.
Se desconectaron algunos amigos para saludar. Profesor Daniel Sá.